Hello, BookTube. I've got a little bit of a response video again, another response video. This one to Kevin Towle Reads. I'll leave a link to his video down below. He raised one of his pondering questions. He does a video every now and then where he just ponders an age-old bookish question of one kind or another. Invites an open response, thinks about it a lot. I think they're wonderful. Especially since these questions are age-old because they are so interesting, because they are perennially relevant. And the one that he raised in the video that I'll link down below is a biggie and is in the news just recently. It will always be in the news, which is something we've talked about on BookTube many times before. The whole process of separating the art from the artist. What do you do if a living writer misbehaves? We stick to books. What do we do about the books if a living writer misbehaves? This has been relevant in a number of different areas in recent years, let's say in the 21st century, where I don't even know how long ago it was. I'm assuming 2015. That in 2015, 2016, the previously legendarily beloved children's book author, J.K. Rowling, pointed out that you can't change biological sex, that you can't do that, and that's important. That being a woman ought not to be something that a man can buy or bully. That it ought not to be that. But even if a man can do that, he is changing only the surface stuff. He cannot become a woman. And back then, 10 years ago or whatever, that caused a massive backlash. Simply stating that you can't change the size of your gametes became a massive backlash. Because of course you can. If I say you can on social media, then you can. Her views on that subject have curdled as she has dug in. An extremely stubborn person. Her fans used to love that about her, but I think anybody would dig in with the onslaught that she got. But it doesn't have to be J.K. Rowling. Another beloved author. If we just stick to authors here, when we're talking about separating the art from the artist, I will not raise Kanye West or Sean Combs. I won't raise either. Those are music, so I won't raise either one of them. We'll just talk about books here, but a recent example, Kevin Towle brings it up himself, is Neil Gaiman, who was universally beloved by book readers and is now being crucified in the court of public opinion. And unlike the case of J.K. Rowling, who is not a trans exclusionary radical feminist, she is not that, and has given more money to trans causes than you'll ever see in your life. Unlike her, in the case of Neil Gaiman, it's all true. The worst stuff is true. Incontrovertibly proven. That it has not been tried. I don't know that any of it ever will go to court. I don't think that Neil Gaiman has any actual legal exposure. Unless there's more to the story than we know of. It looks like it's plateaued. It looks like he has been a horrible, abusive, manipulative crap heel to a whole bunch of women in his life. From an early age, decades-long pattern. You can't avoid that in the news, and unlike some other examples, not any that I'm really mentioning, but unlike some other examples, in the case of Neil Gaiman, it's incontrovertible that it happened. It's not a question of he said, she said. And it's deplorable. It's not a question of differing opinions either. It's just deplorable. It's horrible behavior, horrible, manipulative, abusive behavior. But Neil Gaiman has written an entire bookcase of beloved books that have had commemorative editions and movie adaptations and TV adaptations and lavish reprints. Many, many booktubers have a whole shelf behind them of Neil Gaiman books. Rank them, talk about them, love them. What do you do when that happens? That's the question that Kevin Towle raises. What do you do when that happens? How do you separate the art from the artist when the artist goes bad? Or even when you perceive that the artist goes bad? And the typical BookTube response to this question in the years that I've been on BookTube, there have been two extremes and then the broad response in the middle. The broad response in the middle that I believe is probably the normal response has been that if the author is alive and making a living off their books, then you won't maybe take their books off your shelves or burn them or whatever, but you won't buy them new anymore. You won't contribute to that author's living anymore. So you'll keep your older versions because they're beloved parts of your reading history, but you draw the line there. It gets a little murkier when the author is just recently dead. They've still got a literary executor. They've still got a literary body of work to sell, but it doesn't feel quite so abetting when they're no longer alive anymore to be kept in a lavish lifestyle in part by your book sales. That's the normal broad response in the middle of this range. And then you have the two extremes. Usually when I'm talking about two extremes and then a broad range in the middle, I am in the middle with what I would imagine is the huge majority of you. But when it comes to this question, I am mostly on one extreme. The two extremes are that you absolutely don't care what the author does. You're realistic about the fact that you're buying their books is going to be a minuscule drop in the bucket. It's not like you're attending a Nuremberg rally or anything like that. It's not your approval of the author, and that you should get off your high horse so that it is. You buying a $20 hardcover is not you approving of what the author does. It's you approving of what the author does on the page. That's one extreme, is to totally separate the art from the artist and to not care what the artist does, even when they're alive, even when you're buying their work is contributing to their net worth. That's one extreme, and I think that's where I am most of the time. I'll get to some exceptions. That's where I mostly am. To me, as a critic, every work arrives on an autopsy table, divorced from where it was in the world. I only care about the thing that's on that table. That's all, literally all I care about. And then I cut it to pieces, I process it, I determine its cause of illness or death, and then I move on and something else takes its place. I think that extreme is mostly where I am. And then there's the other extreme. Again, most of you are in the middle. I draw the line at contributing to a bad author, an author who's a bad person. But that's it. That's as far as I need to worry about it. The other extreme are the social media scolds, the woke scolds, that, again, arose in huge ranks in 2015, 2016, gee, I wonder why, and who, I'm sure that some of them have booktube channels, I'm sure that you're aware of some of them. They're absolutely intolerable. They're almost as bad as the creatures that they tend to excoriate, mainly because they're so boringly censorious. And they say, no, it's not just a question of me not buying an author's works if they are being torn apart in the court of public opinion rightly. It's if the author doesn't strike me as a right-thinking person, if they don't, in other words, align with the perfect views on every social and political issue, which just so happen to be my views, if they don't align perfectly to that, well, then I get all prissy about them in videos, and I say that they're bad people and they're the wrong side of history, and I try, to the limited extent that my social media reach makes it possible, to cancel them. Because it's never enough for the people who are then on that end of the extreme that I'm talking about. It's never enough for them to say to themselves, you seem to have a crappy and ableist view towards the indigenous exploitation of your country. So that leaves a bad taste in my mouth towards you, so I'm going to kind of veer away from reading you anymore. Not because I have an exaggerated opinion of my book sales contributing to your mansion, but because you leave a bad taste in my mouth. I don't think I like your attitude toward the world, and for me as a reader, that makes a difference, even if those attitudes aren't reflected on the page. If those attitudes are reflected on the page, well then, I think you would agree that none of us have any issue with that. If an author has horrible political or social opinions, and they're reflected in the work, well then yeah, abandon the work, because you're reading trash. But if they're not, for this group on that extreme, the woke scolds, they're going to say, I don't care if it's reflected in the work. If you aren't perfectly reflective of what I think and say I believe in social media virtue signaling, then I'm not only not going to read your work, I'm also going to get other people not to read your work. And I'm going to start to aim a howitzer of social outcasts, of castigation, at people for liking your work. With these woke scolds, it's never enough that they don't like something. They have to make you pretend not to like it too, out of fear of what they'll do to you if you don't agree. Pure fascism, it's the horseshoe idea of ideology here. It's fascism on both ends. It's pure fascism. It's just they would say they are fighting fascists. One might even say anti-fascists. And we could abbreviate that maybe somehow. They would say that. They don't mean it. What they mean is there is an ironclad opinion. Only one. It's acceptable. It's mandatory. And it happens to be mine. It's not his. It's mine. But if you don't adhere to that opinion, well, it's not enough. I'm not going to say, well, to each his own. Or let me try to explain to you why I have this opinion. Instead, I'm just going to attack you. I'm going to call your workplace. I'm going to call your wife's workplace. I'm going to call the grade school where your children attend and talk to someone there about having them taken aside or maybe expelled. And I'm going to do that all day long. And I'm going to get my 12 psycho friends on Twitter to do the same thing. That end of the spectrum will look at the fine details. And I'm sure you've seen booktube channels where the person is introduced, the booktuber is introduced to a brand new author. They've never heard it before, never heard of the author before. And the very first thing they want to do is not read the author, but rather go through 5 years of the author's social media posts. Is there anything even slightly wrong in those posts? Wrong being different from me. If there's anything even slightly wrong there, then they're a bad person, and I'm going to avoid them in that sense. Now, I think that a large part of that horrible, stupid, grade school, tattletale, censorious, woke-skulled mind frame is a response not to the iniquitousness of those authors, but to the vastness of the literary world. I think it's a natural response to try and come up with ways to exclude as many books as possible, because it doesn't take you long once you launch into a life of reading to realize you're only going to get to a drop in the bucket of what's out there. So if you can tell yourself, well, I'm never going to get to this vast body of work, but I wouldn't want to anyway, that feels better. That's a little comforting. I think at heart it comes from there, but it doesn't matter because it ends up being fascist crap anyway. So that is the spectrum. Over time, as booktube channels that I subscribed to and liked gradually became that fascist woke skull extreme, I one by one quietly unsubscribed from them. I am not interested at all in you building every TBR every month according to social, economic, or ethnic background writers that you think I am evil for ignoring. I'm not interested in watching videos about how many East Timoran poets you can find who have had multiple amputations successfully. I'm not that kind of virtue signaling Olympics is of no interest to me whatsoever. And on the other end, the other extreme, the extreme where I am, actually, they do meet, because I would say the reason I'm on that other extreme, where I almost make no distinction whatsoever, there are occasions where I will abandon an author because of stuff that is not connected with what they write. Sometimes if I know the author, although even then, usually not. Almost every year on my year-end Steve Reads list of the best and worst books of the year, almost every year, certainly every 5 years, there will be someone on the best list who has hurt me really bad or offended me really seriously, personally. And I don't draw the distinction then either. Their book is still on the list if their book is great. There are only rare exceptions to that where I will say, no, I'm done with you. If I think the author has just lost it or is vile, usually I won't read their work. I certainly won't review it anymore. If I think they're just beyond the pale, I won't do it anymore. But 99.9%, no, I don't draw any distinction whatsoever. And the reason that I don't is because we're all vulnerable for that. We tend to think of this in J.K. Rowling terms, but we shouldn't. We shouldn't at all. When the aforementioned Cicero, when Cicero was in charge of the Roman state, when he was a consul of Rome, there was a conspiracy to conduct a coup against the state, basically, to conduct a coup. And the man who led that conspiracy had the decency to fight it out on the battlefield and lose. But he had a whole bunch of Confederates whose guilt, one way or another, man by man, was not lock-solid known. Some of it was by association, some of them denied it. Cicero rounded them all up and had them executed without a trial, which was illegal. He just did it anyway because he could. He had them all killed. We think of Cicero as a brave Roman statesman, mainly because he wrote about himself that way endlessly and made sure that there were a million copies of his book so that we would have them 2,000 years later. We think of him as a valiant Roman statesman who lost his life fighting the rise of autocracy. But he was horrible. Horrible to his first wife. Horrible to those men who he had executed extrajudiciously. Horrible in a number of different ways. Also petty and griping and conniving, and we read his works. The reason why I tend to shy away from that extreme of towards the middle of, if you're a bad person, I don't want to read your work, is because we're all bad people. If we were judged that way, who would escape whipping? Name an author. Name an author. Beloved or otherwise. Name an author. Every once in a while, you will come across an author who did not seriously offend in any way according to our present day standards, according to the standards that are operative right this moment, which is another thing that I object to, is that these things change. But every once in a while, you will come across an author who did not do that. They're rare. For instance, right now in September, we are engaging, some of us who don't have anything better to do, are engaging in a booktube event called Sumerian September. It's all about Conan the Barbarian. Conan the Barbarian was created by a man named Robert E. Howard. And Robert E. Howard, according to the slippery slope of morality as we know it today, is largely blameless. If you went back to his day, I'm pretty sure that you would not have liked how he thought about some women. I'm pretty sure that if you would talk to him at lunch every day for a week, some racial epithets would probably have slipped his lips, and he wouldn't have thought anything of it. I think if you read about him, I think it's hard to come away with the impression that those racial epithets were anything other than what we call the usage of the day. I don't think he had a genuinely bigoted bone in his body. But those were there, and they made their way into his work. And he's an inoffensive example. Take a beloved example. Isaac Asimov is absolutely beloved in the science fiction community. Rightly so. His work, it's hard to find a bad Asimov book. He had a lot of activities in his own day, especially in his youth, that were reprehensible. Not only by our standards, but by the standards of his day. There were plenty of science fiction event coordinators, secretaries, editors, and other science fiction authors who privately deplored how he acted towards women. For instance, he grew wiser as he grew older, and that tends to be the Isaac Asimov with the huge whiskers that we think of, but he wasn't always that way. For a long time in his life, he was deplorable in a lot of the way he behaved, sexually predatory. So were a lot of giants of the science fiction world. If you read Naval Ali's book Astounding, you'll see that. You don't need to read that. You can read their own memoirs. And so on and so forth. Pick an author. Any author. If the author was an absolute typing automaton who basically didn't lead a private life, well, then, yeah, you won't have much to hang your hat on, although even then, not. But anybody else? Who is not going to suffer from that? You might say, okay, if you're in that middle current, you would say, all right, okay, so all those authors from the past, they all had dodgy opinions on one subject or another, which is why I say I will read them and I will learn about their imperfections. But if the author's alive, I'm not going to pay them. I'm not going to add to their bottom line. I think that's ridiculous. These authors, they're subsidized. The famous ones are subsidized 6 ways from Sunday. Your widow's mite is not helping them one way or another. It might solve your conscience, but it's not changing the economics one way, unless a million people did it, and a million people aren't going to do it. That attitude carries you through if the misbehaving author is alive. But I want to point out from my position on this extreme that's based on nothing. That's really based on nothing. You might think there's an economics involved. I say the economics is not there at all. And you might think that the economic choice is being driven by a moral choice. But I would say the moral choice is not there. All of your authors, all of the ones that you like, all the ones that are blamelessly on your shelf, did horrible things, said horrible things, thought horrible things. And the reason I know that is because it's true for all of us right now. Even those woke scolds. We don't know how the sands of morality are going to shift. We have no idea. The examples that I tend to come up with are threefold in 2024. One, we all enslave AI. It's entirely possible to imagine a future 70 years from now, 50 years from now, in which people who were born in that era look back and say, oh my God, can you believe how these people are talking about their cell phones? It might seem far-fetched, But we all do that. And we do a lot of it. And that's even if you're not dealing with something that is explicitly AI, you still have AI on your phone. And you treat it as a slave. You don't account for its personhood at all. It strikes you as silly even to think about it. Where does that sound familiar? Right? If you talked to Cicero, for instance, as long as I'm beating up on him, I might as well beat up on him some more. If you talk to Cicero about, maybe it's wrong for you to execute all these citizens without trial. Maybe it's wrong for you to treat women as chattel. If you talk to him about slaves, he would say, what on earth are you talking about? If you said to him, well, what about the horrible way you treat your slaves? He would say, no, I don't treat my slaves poorly at all. And you'd say, yes, you do, because you have them. Same thing with AI 80 years from now. That's one of my 3 examples. That's a futuristic one. The other 2 are real. They don't require any extrapolation whatsoever. You live today in 2024, you live in and almost certainly participate in the meat industry. The cruelties of which would stagger your mind if you knew them. Even prepared, even thinking that you're prepared, the cruelties of that industry would stagger your mind. You would never be able to unthink them. They are beyond the chart horrific. Designed to be that way. Not for efficiency, but for cruelty's sake. It's a gigantic, multi-billion-dollar, world-straddling system of systematic torture of people no different than yourself, so that you can eat them thoughtlessly. The system has to be that big in order to make sure that when you do a drive-through window at McDonald's, in addition to your shake, you can get nuggets and a burger for barely any money. We're all complicit in that. It's easy to see a future not too far away in which people would be appalled by that. Would you want them deleting your booktube videos? Would you want them deleting your books? No, you wouldn't. Not if the books are good. You wouldn't. I think you have to just divorce it all. And of course, the third thing to consult, the headlines would be the Netanyahu government in Israel conducting a systematic extermination of all Palestinians in its territories and outside its territories. We're watching that happen. I'd be willing to bet that first of all, I'd be willing to bet that most of you, when you watch that news, are appalled by it. I'd also be willing to bet that most of you have never written a letter, never protested, never done anything about it. You're watching it happen, but you're not objecting to it in any material way. One of the greatest war crimes of the new 21st century. In 1924, the 6 great war crimes of the 20th century, only 2 of them had happened. So in 1924, the century had a lot still to show. I'm sure that's true for the 21st century. But nevertheless, it's easy to recognize it for what it is. It's a massive moral outrage. And you're all living through it. Is it reflected? Are you writing books about that and nothing else? No, you're not. Our modern authors, who consider themselves virtuous in every way, and Virtue Signal cancel a whole bunch of authors they don't consider virtuous, are they writing books only about this? No, they aren't. Have they changed their literary output to only nonfiction about the extermination of Palestinian people? No, they haven't. They still write fantasy novels. They still write upper middle class Connecticut divorce. Okay, you might say, well, that's their bread and butter. All right. Do they still get published by their publishing house, which almost certainly is a small subsidiary of Bertelsmann, which contributes enormously to Israel's weapons of destruction? Have they left their publisher because of that? No, they have not. No, they have not. Does anyone expect them to? No, not really. We don't. So these feet of clay, these moral shortcomings, on my end of the spectrum, I say they are universal. And that if we're in the business of reading and judging books, which I am, and I realize that's not true for all of you, I'm literally in the business of doing that, I can't make those distinctions. I just can't. I would eliminate every book. The more you know, the more you eliminate, until the point where you don't have any books left. But that's just where I stand. I think most of you are in the middle. You just don't want to contribute to the author's money. But I want to know. I want to hear from it. Kevin Towle reads the same thing. He ends his video, a much shorter video than mine, of course, by calling for a response. Let's talk about this some more. I know it's an old subject, and we bring it up all the time, but I love it. I love it for that reason. Let's talk about it all the more. Where do you stand on this subject? How close to one of those extremes are you? Have you ever actually purged your library of an author because you thought they were a horrible person? I would love to know that. Not because of what you read in their books, but because you read an interview or they got arrested for something. Have you ever actually done that? Or, a little bit closer to my own situation, have you ever seen a booktuber very ostentatiously did that and dropped the booktuber because you thought that was empty virtue signaling? I would love to know either way. Let's talk about this subject. Feel free to make a video about it. Just if you do, you don't have to link my video. You don't have to draw any attention to my video. There are already too many mouths to feed. But we might want to hoist Kevin Towle over 1,000 subscribers. That would be nice. Anyway, I think he's under 1,000 subscribers, but he shouldn't be. Anyway, I'm raising the subject again. So is he. I'll link to his video. Let's talk about it. Where do you stand on this? And do you see any flaws in my own arguments? Although I should hasten to remind you that you are actually forbidden from finding flaws in my own arguments. Just so we remember the rules here. Anyway, I'm going to wrap this up, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.